So Mmusi, thank you so much for making time to share your insights into the future of leadership. But before we walk into the future, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up?
Well, Dr. Nick, thank you for the kind privilege of being part of this conversation. I am a proud Sowetan. I was born in Dobsonville, a suburb of Soweto. I grew up to two parents. My mother is from the Eastern Cape, which is historically the Xhosa part of South Africa. And my father comes from the Northwest, which is more Tswana speaking side of South Africa. And historically, they met in Soweto. And the reason that matters is because I come as a combination of two sets of cultures. So I've always grown up in a diverse home. We're a football-loving family. I grew up playing football. And now, as I've grown up, I grew up in one of those children that had this part of their lives in apartheid and part of their lives in democratic South Africa post-1994. I studied at a fairly school in Soweto and then studied in what they typically in South Africa call the ex-Model C schools, which are the first sort of schools that were a combination. I have 2 master's degrees in public administration and theology. So I've grown up with a deep faith, but equally so a deep public understanding of what sense of justice we need to put in the world. And so I feel like, to sum up Mmusi's story, has really been a story of being one who has had the opportunity to be able to straddle a diverse world and has sought to build a world where diversity can thrive.
And Mmusi, what was your dream career when you grew up?
Bizarrely, I was raised by a Catholic grandmother who was a very strong Catholic. In fact, my middle name is Aloysius. And for the first time, I saw a Saint Aloysius in Germany. And it was a very strong Catholic priest and sainthood. And so I grew up believing maybe I should either become a soccer player or become a Catholic priest, funny enough. And so I think if I was to focus now on what I do, obviously the work that I'm doing has led me to what I genuinely believe my life's call is, which is about impact of people. But I thought if I was not a Catholic priest, I'd become an educator of some sort.
And tell us, Mmusi, who inspired you in your early days?
You know, the cocktail of Soweto is one such that people like Nelson Mandela don't become these figures that exist in the broad space. They become people who are in your neighborhood. So my home in Dobsonville to where Nelson Mandela was is a walking distance. I could literally get there. Sure, it's a bit of a long trip. But someone like Nelson Mandela is someone I drew profound inspiration from, as would most people in the world, but for totally different reasons. Here was someone who was willing to confront status quo and take up his own people in a fight for a greater good. I had probably my closest inspiration was a Catholic nun called Sister Christina Mutloung, who was the headmistress of the school that we lived in. And she kind of insisted that, Mmusi, you can be better than what the system tells you you are. And growing up under apartheid, that voice mattered a lot because she taught us that what the system said Black people were less than, we couldn't think. She said, no, we are greater than that. And so she's been a deep inspiration for me.
And Mmusi, you studied psychology at UNISA, public administration at WITS, and theology in Wales. What is the best memory from your days of education and university?
Probably university days. I was part of a class of South Africans back then. It was uncommon to have a very close interaction with leaders from different political parties. And when I did a master's in public administration at WITS, I was working with adults, some of which had been in public service, Others had been staunch ANC members. At the time, I was the mayoral candidate or premier candidate for the DA. And so it became this war. And then, of course, we were debating public administration. So I feel like I had a taste of parliament before I got to parliament. And one of my fondest memories was us having this debate until a lecturer decided that they would give us an unfair marking. And suddenly we all had to democratically elect a leader who would represent us against the University of Wits University. They happened to elect me, but I thought to myself, I could, for the first time, get votes from ANC people, public administration people. It's probably the only election I've successfully won to this date. So I became the class representative at that point to try and stand for an election. So it was one of a fun memory of dialogue among South Africans who shared vastly different political ideologies. You know?
Right. And Mmusi, as the former leader of the opposition in the National Assembly of South Africa and the founder of the One South Africa movement, you had many turning points in your career. What would you say was maybe the one or two most formative turning points that brought you to where you are today?
One, perhaps maybe politically, started off when I stood as premier candidate in 2014. That was a significant campaign. It was important because we went out there and said, could people believe that we could bring about change? And it started off with a campaign where we would attract crowds of 10, 15, 20 people. It felt like we were not going anywhere. And towards the end of that campaign, it was significant enough that we had to literally take out a stadium to try and accommodate one of the last events that we did. And it was a genuine reminder that hope actually inspires people. The second was probably more difficult than that. I happened to fly to Israel and Palestine, and it was soon after that particular campaign. And I can remember having been to Palestine and having been to Israel. I had a meeting with the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. We had all agreed sitting in the meeting not to publish that picture. And then a picture of both him and I featured on public platforms. And I can remember at the time the backlash that you experienced for something that we'd managed and the political manufacturing of outrage around that issue, where the South African government stood for a two-state solution, which was what I stood for. And then you realized, I think it was a turning point for me, because I realized that actually convictions in leadership matter the most. You can have great ideas, you can do whatever. At the end of the day, it's what your convictions are, because opposition will come, whether warranted or unwarranted. You have to stick to a particular course of action. And I think that was probably, for me, a very significant, a very difficult period, because here suddenly I had to defend something I didn't think I would need to. And here I had to argue for something, but it was ultimately a space that was a genuine reminder that your job is to ensure that your convictions are clear.
And Mmusi, what would you say is driving you today?
I think, more than anything, I hold the view that says we have the value of Ubuntu. I happen to believe that all of us are Africans, that this continent is the place where the origins of mankind come from. We offer to people something beautiful in that it's a much more human face, as Steve Biko so correctly pointed out. And what drives me today is not only faith in a deeper and a high purpose, but it's a faith in the fact that as humanity, we can find that in each other. And consistently, if there's been a theme in my life, it's been one South Africa. The ideals that say we could build, regardless of how diverse people are, we could work together. And so given the legacy of leaders who have come through, from Archbishop Desmond Tutu to people like Beyers Naudé, Nelson Mandela, and so many, that there's a legacy and a heritage of leadership that we have a duty to continue forward. And even at a personal level, as one who is married to a white South African, having mixed race children, you don't have a choice but to fight for a country that will ultimately ensure that each of them are seen for who they are, the divine in them, the humanity in them, the sense of Ubuntu. You have to fight for it. And I think Coretta Scott King summed it up well when she said, freedom is never won. It must be fought for in every generation. So I feel like I'm part of that generation who have to write the next chapter of South Africa. So it's a big dream, but it's what keeps me going daily, and a deep faith and a conviction towards saying it is possible.
Now, Mmusi, looking into the future, what does the future of leadership mean to you?
I think we've been through multiple phases of leaders. You know, we had the command control phase, where if I think about perhaps maybe times of war, through maybe the Second World War, we had these big figures, these big, you know, Churchill type characters who determined that. And I think we've seen it even in when you head towards the 90s, leaders who produced a sense of certainty about the world. They were certain that capitalism would either solve the world's problems or socialism would solve the world's problems. And therefore, those ideological worlds have come through. But I think post coincidentally, the collapse of the Berlin Wall feels like it was a drawn timeline that said the world will change, the world will globalize, which means that not only could we sit in our own isolated spaces, but we had to be part of a collective. And so you kind of saw more of that team leadership type of work coming into play. I think now we're heading into a phase where, if I could call it spiritual or sensory type leadership, is what we're going into now. I think strategic planning is no longer an art that will thrive. It has to be strategic thinking and strategic sensing. We're going into a world of high uncertainty, a world where ultimately our best models could not produce the perfect science of predicting what we're going to do. That the world is so diverse and so accountable in public life that you have to have a gut feel, a sense of where the world needs to go. And I think a combination of that collaboration, direction, but a deep sensing is what the future, I think, of leadership is going to be. And it manifests itself in all sectors. Whether it's in business, we can accept that the world has got volatile markets and people have to think about and sense their way through them. Whether it's in politics, where we're seeing a polarized universe, that leaders who can bring people together, who people have a sense that they can trust and follow, that's part of where we got to go. And a restoration of values, the idea that actually it's a values-based leadership that allows us to say, can we coalesce not around me as a person or the leader, but coalesce around these values and collectively chart our way forward. I really believe that this next phase of leadership will be about that. I cannot see, if you like, the command, control, that sort of authoritarianism returning with ease in the world, because I think people have become a lot more suspicious of leadership and are mistrusting of institutions. So we've got to restore values and create a sense upon which leaders can lead with humility, knowing where we potentially need to go, but allowing followers to trust, to ask them questions, to be able to interrogate them, and for a dialogue to occur between leaders and those who follow them.
And Mmusi, what have you learned from your own leadership journey that you consider most important for building and empowering future leaders?
You know, I think probably at a personal level, it's that leadership itself is about the ownership of your convictions and pursuing them. It's coincidentally, I don't believe that always about being the most intelligent person in the room, because naturally all you are is the leader. You don't have to be the most intelligent in the room. I've learned quite deliberately to say that at the end of the day, it's a bit like driving a vehicle. In fact, I share this often with my wife and kids to say, the knowledge of a leader is whoever is holding the steering wheel, whether the car is stable on the road or it's off the road. Because when you hold your convictions, the road to success of those convictions, like I have a conviction for a non-racial society, a society built around values, it's not always a straightforward path to that. Along the way, you're going to get some things wrong. Along the way, it's going to be opposed. Along the way, as I saw in the elections, that sometimes people reject that vision. and choose polarization, but you can't let go of the steering wheel. You've got to keep holding on to it because you have a conviction about where we're going to go. And over a long period of time, you win. But I've found that great failing of leaders is when A, they quit, and B, they surrender their convictions, either at the sacrifice of elections or at the sacrifice of money. Then you have a hollowed out leadership that becomes clever, that becomes all of those things, but truly without convictions or soul. And so to me, it's been an incredible lesson to, and you don't know this when you start out as a leader. I think as a leader, you seek to always emulate or you do whatever. But to learn to trust what sits deep inside of you is not only your unique gift to the team, it's your unique resonance to the world. And I think you need to own it because no one else is going to do it for you.
So Mmusi, what is your advice for future leaders when it comes to social media? How should they navigate and handle social media to build their own leadership brand?
Yeah. I mean, I think first of all, we must realize that part of the difficulty with social media is that it can sometimes invite people to be inauthentic on social media.
Yeah.
And secondly, that you must realize that social media in certain platforms is conflictual by nature. There will be people who will want to attack you on there. At least as a public leader, I've found that often people are incentivized on social media to pick a fight with you. What typically becomes a Twitter war or whatever the battles look like. So I think that the first tip is remember what you say on social media needs to be reflected in real life. I think more than anything, people hate hypocrisy. So be authentic about that and remind ourselves that in many ways, haters gonna hate, as the young people say on social media. But I think that always remind yourself that you don't have to engage every troll that's on social media. You have a message to produce, make sure it's engaged with authentically, and be consistent in terms of your own lifestyle on both sets of whatever, so that not to use social media as a place to portray an image of yourself that is distant from who you are. So if you keep an authenticity about it and use it as a platform for your message, for the space to engage people, then I think it's helpful. But the moment it's for other motives, I think you fall short as a leader and you become exposed quite quickly.
Now, Mmusi, these are challenging times, especially for future leaders. What is your advice in terms of challenges? What are some of the biggest challenges future leaders should expect to encounter in their career?
I think as the world is becoming polarized, I think one of the great challenges that I think leaders are going to have to face up with is to steer away from populism born out of polarization. Yeah. We see in big democracies issues like that occur in the sense that a leader finally has to stop the ideal but do what is popular with people. And I think it may seem workable in the short term, but it's certainly not sustainable in the long run. I think ultimately leaders must realize the fact that they're leading constituents who have now different renewed power. And as per apropos our previous conversation about social media, I think we must realize that there can be another force that seeks to undermine or support your leadership, whichever way you look at it. And part of you as a leader is to realize that in a world where littered with traps for leaders, littered with attacks on leaders, and littered with saying to yourself, you're going to be leading constituencies that are diverse. Steer away from populism, steer away with polarization, and ultimately lead for ideals. And I think that probably to me is part of the crisis that leaders face. It's an uncertain world, it's a new world, and I think it's a great opportunity. So in some ways, as Cortés said, we all need to burn the boats. We need to forget the world as we've come from. We need to unlearn certain things, because I do think part of the challenge for leaders is to presume that what worked 5 years or even a year ago is going to be appropriate for next year. I mean, let me use a parallel and a very practical example here. Learning out of the leadership of President Ramaphosa, a number of months ago, pronounced on national television that actually there'd be no mandatory vaccines required for people. And now, as the world globally is starting to instill mandatory vaccines, it may be helpful for him, uses that position, to be willing to come before citizens and say, I reacted 6 months ago, whenever that was, with a set of facts. Those have changed. And as a leader, I must be willing to come back to you and say, maybe I spoke too soon, or I spoke with imperfect knowledge, but as new knowledge arises on a virus, here's a new position I'm willing to take, and I'm asking you to come along with me on this journey. It's not indecision, but it's a sense, again, of saying you are leading in an uncertain universe and sensing your way through different scenarios. And I think that would be helpful. But if you presume that the old method of leadership is command to say you stick to whatever decision you made back then and it's unchangeable or all of that, I think is going to be a challenge for leaders, because ultimately citizens themselves will begin to sense an inauthenticity and a lack of dialogue. I think we need to come back to a more humble and more honest type of, and much more consultative in this space to be able to lead people forward a little bit more better than what we have before. I think as institutions are failing all across the world, whether the institution be the church, politics, or even family, I think citizens are less trusting of leaders. And I think that's going to be hard work for you to instill that trust. And part of it is being able to communicate honestly, clearly, and actually with a degree of humility that says to you, you are willing to be wrong if that's what needs to be, because ultimately the greater vision, the greater conviction is what's got to thrive.
Now, Mmusi, since you mentioned learning and unlearning, if you were to design a curriculum for future leaders, what are some of the new skills you would want to factor in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sense of strategic thinking rather than strategic planning, the idea of being able to decision making now and the instincts, how those work. This whole exercise about making sure that leaders at least have an analytical knowledge about what some of the trends look like so as to lead better. I would argue that as part of the curriculum of leaders is, in some ways, how do they self-manage? Because one of the things that social media has done is that it's given people access to leaders in a way that maybe previously people didn't have before. People don't just get to know the leader in what you choose to tell them to. If they have enough time on the internet, they can work out quite quickly where you live, what kind of lifestyle you have, etc. And therefore, I think before you can produce public leadership, private leadership will matter equally so. Now, why that's relevant in the 21st century is that maybe if you took someone like Winston Churchill or Roosevelt, both of them privately had their own challenges. Churchill drank a lot. And I wonder whether in today's culture would have not been a disqualifier given the knowledge of introspection people make towards leaders nowadays. Mm-hmm. So I would urge more seriously that leaders need to also be conscious that you lead upwards, you lead sideways, and you lead downwards. Your mentors, your mentees, but the people who follow you and just yourself becomes a crucial component of the skills you ought to have in your arsenal so that you know how to operate in a new world. And then lastly, I think, as we migrate towards the meta universe, as it were, leaders need to know how to operate in that world in a way that perhaps they haven't needed to before, as societies are changing and will require a different set of skills going forward. So I want to encourage digital education, future studies, and if I was to say, the notion of self-leadership or managing your own personal integrity as a leader is going to be crucial going forward.
And Mmusi, as a mentor to future leaders, can you maybe, and I know there's hundreds of stories, but maybe can you share a success story or two where you mentored an upcoming leader and that person took your advice to heart?
I worked with a young female who came into an organization as a lawyer and was now operating in a different terrain. And here she was now working in in public service. And she faced a crisis upon which now suddenly she had to be challenged publicly. And the management of media and social media around it became one that was difficult. And one of the things I said to them was that A, be consistent, and B, you need to direct the facts quickly and immediately. And furthermore, look to advance your cause, because that's a platform upon which you come from, and then lead citizens through it. And I'm grateful she took that advice, because often at many times, when you are in public confrontation, it's easy to become factional and to lose your position as leader. Because ultimately, why people follow you is that they're looking for direction. They're looking for you to point somewhere. They're not looking for you to be someone who's going to be swayed by the wind. They're not looking for you to join a particular faction. You are the visionary. You are the one who must help us figure out what the immediate next step must be. You don't have to know the end from the beginning, but at least instinctively figure out what the next thing we ought to be is. And I think it's something that I try and give to each of our mentors. I try and almost in some ways demystify their actions, because I think sometimes we can study leaders retrospectively and see their successes, but fail to see where they've not done things right or what mistake, and to allow that grace to be able to flow through what they do and what your mentors and mentees do. So I think it's an age-old cliche. We learn a lot from our failures than we do from our successes. I think sometimes it'd be helpful for leaders, particularly in a mentorship space, to be able to share where they've gotten things wrong. I have gotten many things wrong, but part of it is about knowing, okay, here are the mistakes I've made. And so even for the people I mentor, I work with now, I try and do as best as I can to keep sharing with them where we've made decisions that have not borne the fruit as we wanted them to do.
Now, Mmusi, since you mentioned sharing of mistakes, sharing of successes, before we wrap up, would you mind sharing your thoughts on who maybe are role models of leadership that future leaders should study and possibly learn from?
Sure. A few that I admire. I certainly think the current CEO of Discovery in Adrian Gore is a leader who is worth studying, simply because I think part of the work that Adrian has done at Discovery is not only grown a multi-billion rand company, but has owned the sense of being an African contributing in a global environment. I think he's a leader to watch out for. A close personal friend of mine is someone I've had an opportunity to know, not only the public role, but the private, is someone like the Dutch Prime Minister, who doesn't lead out of this command space, but really leads out of a deep sense of humility, but helps negotiate complex coalitions and lead the Dutch nation forward. I think even at a social level, someone like Archbishop Makgoba, in the sense of creating conscience and conscientization in society, is a living model of someone who's been able to keep their public and private life integrous, but also speaking truth to power when it mattered most. So I think South Africa, we're spoiled with really some really great leaders. We've also seen some really bad examples of leadership, because position does not always equate leadership. We've seen people arise in serious positions in society and fail to lead. But I would imagine just those three, looking at them, and as people I've known, I can vouch for their lives, have seen how well they've been able to navigate this terrain of complex leadership, and are worth studying and worth reflecting on.
So, Mmusi, how can our listeners connect with you, and where should they follow you?
Well, typically, Mmusi is I'm on LinkedIn, or you can follow me on Twitter, on Mmusi Maimane, or on Instagram, and then also on Facebook. And we do a podcast called Things with Mmusi. And so, yeah, but more seriously, I'm always very keen to hear from leaders, hear their experiences. So I'm happy for people to email me, and let's continue the dialogue, because I think accessibility and co-learning is partly the secret to future leadership. to approach it and walk in and say, yeah, I operate within a team. And what are some key lessons, not only here in South Africa, but globally, that we can learn from, I think is a vital dynamic of the future of leadership anyway. So,
last but not least, Mmusi, what is your message to the millions of kids who are now leaving school in this country, in Africa, across the world, and are now looking to start a career of their own? What would you say are maybe one or two success factors they should consider?
Be crystal clear about what things are your convictions, because those help you draw your lines of integrity, but they also help you draw lines of what you want to fix in the world. It doesn't matter whether you're a doctor, a teacher, whatever profession you take. If you fail to understand what you are trying to fix and why you are trying to fix, you end up not only with the lack of sustainability around that, but you end up worshiping the results of that. And therefore, for many people, I've found them ending up, pursuing money. Now, money is an interesting indicator, but it cannot be the only indicator. You'll make money, you'll lose money. But if your business is set up in such a way that it is to address a serious need in society, then you stop the greed born out of capitalism. You become one led by conviction so that you can make the impact that you need to make in the world. And then you yourself know what your red lines are and what actions of integrity. To a grade 12 learner who's finishing now, my genuine encouragement to you is this, is figure out those two things and try and figure them out quite early. You may not know them in its entirety, but they become the guardrails that stop you from actually making decisions that are incongruent with what you are innately made to do. So for me, when I finished school, I can remember this, I was very good at accounting and mathematics. And naturally, I thought I was going to be an accountant. But the only reason I wanted to be an accountant wasn't because even though I was good at both those subjects, I didn't love math, science, and I didn't love just the career. All I just wanted was, I saw an accountant and I thought these people earn a lot of money, and I was a child in Soweto. I'm grateful to know that even though my parents were poor, they gave me the freedom to choose what gave me passion, what aligned with my values, because now today my life is fulfilled and money has become secondary. Other than if I just simply said, I'm just going to go after, not saying that being an accountant is wrong, but I'm just going to go after cash, because once you've got that, then you lose meaning. And ultimately that's what we want to, that's what distinguishes us as human beings than to any other thing, is the articulation of meaning. So my encouragement to you is to figure those two things out. I say to my kids, know your values, know your convictions, and know what problem you're trying to solve in the world. You will find a career out of that, and you'll get the rewards out of that.
Mmusi, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom into the future of leadership, and reminding us that clarity, congruency, and meaning are the keys to success.
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And it's been a great engagement. I look forward to learning from others, and hopefully we can keep this dialogue going.